What would it feel like to take a pair of scissors to the most expensive thing in your closet? Something you saved for weeks to afford? To my great-great-grandmother Carolina, that's what we're about to do.
We've made a pattern, we've got draft number 3, we've made all of the adjustments that need to get made. It is time for me to come face to face with my cutting anxiety because we need to cut out the actual dress itself. Great-great-grandma Caroline, this would have been something she saved and saved and saved for, so she would have probably not had room to make mistakes. She would have had to get very creative with her fabric usage. I am going to try to cut this out as though I was working on that tight of a budget and that tight of a fabric allowance. Trying to sort of channel my ancestors' cutting anxiety. This is the moment of truth, I guess. Imagine how nerve-wracking this would be the way great-great-grandma Caroline was doing it.
One way to avoid fabric waste is to cut your large pieces first, like the skirt, and fit the smaller ones in around them. This episode, I'll be focusing on the skirt and overskirt. We'll come back to the dress bodice next week. This skirt, of a shape fashionable in the late 1870s and early 1880s, has 5 pieces or gores: 1 front, 2 side, and 2 back pieces.
The top of the front panel of the skirt has got 4 darts in it. I've found it is way easier to sew darts by the machine if you've basted them beforehand because there's this ladder stitch method of basting. Pull the thread once you're done and it just folds right up on you perfectly. You don't have to sew around pins, you don't have to worry about things being misaligned.
I'm using my 21st century sewing machine for all the sewing, including these darts and long straight skirt seams, rather than a 19th century one. An antique machine might make for a more physically accurate reproduction, but I don't know how to use antique machines. My great-great-grandma Carolina would find a 19th century treadle machine as comfortable and easy as I find my modern electric one. So, ironically, using a modern machine helps me understand her experience better.
So this is obviously way bigger than my waist. It's going to need a waistband and then it's going to need some way to be put on and taken off. So it's going to get a placket at the back and a waistband, which are all just going to be rectangles of various sizes. The placket is the bit at the back of the skirt where you have 2 sides that are meeting at the center back seam usually, although sometimes it's at the side. And you need to basically tack a little bit of fabric on so that one goes underneath the other and you can put some way of closing the skirt, usually hooks and eyes, onto them. And then you need to reinforce the side that's not overlapping so that you can actually put fasteners on it. I need to cut out 2 rectangles, 12 inches long. One of them is going to be 2 inches wide. That's going to be the reinforcement. It's not going to stick out. And the other one's going to be 3 inches wide because it's going to get folded in half and it's going to stick out about 1 inch so that the 2 pieces overlap.
I left the top of the center back seam open to sew on the placket pieces. Then the seams are pressed open, the rectangles folded around into their respective places, everything is ironed, and top stitched, meaning stitched on the outside. The underskirt waistband won't be visible, so I'm using a cheaper white cotton muslin for it.
To fit however many inches of skirt this is, I don't actually know, and it kind of doesn't matter, to 25 plus an extra for overlap, 26 inches of waistband. The top of the skirt is not really going to be visible. I'm going to do what is called divide and conquer these days in the sewing world. It's a way of making pleats in the fabric without having to calculate anything, without having to think about how big your pleats are, how many pleats you're making. The front of this style of skirt was pretty much always flat, and that's why it's got those darts in it, so it has like a really smooth, flat fit over the front of the hips. I'm just going to fold this in half so I can find the exact center front and just match that up with the center front on this waistband. Pin that in place. Come on, stay put. slight problem though. The front piece of this skirt, if I keep that flat and smooth, that's leaving me only maybe 4 or 5 inches on either end to pleat like this much skirt. I think we might actually have to start the pleating closer in a little bit. Start the pleating an inch in, and that'll free up another inch or so of waistband for me to work with.
Divide and conquer pleating works like this. Find the middle of each section of the skirt and of the waistband you're working with, match them up, and pin together. Now you have 2 sections. Find the middle of each, match, and pin. Keep dividing every section in half until the folds are as small as you want them. Very little measuring involved.
Just fold everything over like that, and you've got a bunch of pleats. And then you encase them in the waistband. They're not the prettiest or most even, but they are functional.
Once it's pleated, the top edge of the skirt is sandwiched in the folded over waistband, and the whole thing is top stitched in place. To get an even hem, I'm trying the skirt on over my bustle pad and petticoat. They'll affect how the material falls.
I've used the hem leveler to mark chalk lines, basically telling me where on this skirt is an even distance off the floor. It's a little longer than I would normally make my skirts because I'm going for authenticity over tripping hazard. I'm gonna be wearing 1.5 inch heels. I'm also going to have to just learn how to not trip on my skirts for this.
The hem of the skirt is turned under twice by around 1/2 inch and sewn in place. It would be too much trouble to iron it first with even my electric iron, and certainly with Carolina's stovetop one.
A lot of times skirts of this era were finished with a ruffle around the bottom. Higher class, you'd see like this really sharp, crisp pleated trim, and for working class dresses or simpler dresses, a lot of times you just see a gathered ruffle. It's easier to launder, it's easier to care for, it doesn't take as much time to do, and you'd often do it in just the same fabric. That's just going to be strips.
Here's a bit of an anachronism. I'm using a rolled hem foot to hem these ruffles because there are nearly 5 yards of ruffle that need both edges finished. The 4 strips are joined at the short edges to make one giant loop.
There's a photo reference that shows this really interesting decorative way of gathering it, where you do 2 lines of gathering stitches about 1 inch apart, and then you gather the ruffle up and you sew it on in those 2 places. And it's a little more constructed, a little nicer looking than just a plain ruffle sewn on in one place like I did on the petticoat. I need to get this on the skirt now. Fold it in half on this side along the center back. Mark those points. I'm gonna use pins just so I don't have to wash pencil marks out later. I'm gonna find the halfway point at each side, which is not conveniently located on the seam. This is a 5-panel skirt. Mark that with pins also. The ruffle is 4 pieces. It's 4 widths of fabric. So I can easily match each quarter marking on the skirt up with a seam on the ruffle.
By sewing a line of long stitches, then pulling the thread tighter, the ruffle is gathered up. It won't stay though, so the threads have to be tied off, the gathered fabric evened out. And then everything's top stitched to hold it in place. Cut out the overskirt. It's kind of like a slimmer version of the normal skirt. You just cut it out, you sew the front darts as normal, and then you bustle and pleat and ruche it up in interesting ways. What's nice is I get to recycle my pattern pieces from the regular skirt with minor adjustments. By minor adjustments, I mean make the front piece a little wider.
The back, I was gonna use the back skirt piece pattern, but it's actually, it's narrower by like 3 or 4 inches and it's just a rectangle. So I'm just gonna cut a rectangle on the fold by measurement and call it good. The waistband, I am going to use the same fabric because this is a little bit more likely to peek out from under the bodice if anything slips. 3-inch strip, turn the ends under, cut it to whatever the right length is. There we go.
This overskirt would take 2 or 3 yards of fabric to make. There's a Bureau of Labor Statistics record that says that female sewing machine operators earned, on average, $1.24 a day in 1880 New York. Those were the good jobs. Doing piecework at home paid less. Carolina might earn the price of the extra fabric in a day. But what else was that money needed for? Rent, food, sending back to family in the old country, supporting the brothers she traveled with.
The books that I have been looking in say that instead of like pulling it up and pinning it to itself and tacking it in place, you actually have pieces of twill tape that you hang from the inside of the skirt, and then you attach all of the drapery to them. I'm going to do the side pleating with math, I think, and then drape the back. Because the sides, at least I can measure. The back sort of has to get adjusted for the bustle pad a little bit more.
I'm using something similar to the divide and conquer method to drape the overskirt. I mark the twill tape off in fourths, then match the center mark to the halfway point down the side seam, pinned, and repeat it. But my first attempt was much too long. We had to cut the twill tape shorter and reevaluate the method.
The front of this is draping really, really long. Sneak another twill tape in, just divided the same way as the ones at the sides, into the center front. I'm just gonna try draping the back the same way, but bigger folds. I like the shape of this at the front. I like how this looks at the sides. I have zero clue what it looks like at the back. I'm gonna go look at my own bustle in the mirror. I'm probably going to hand tack all of these various skirt drapings to the tapes. That'll just be easier than trying to feed it through the machine. Then I'll hem it. That I'll do on the machine. It would take forever by hand. And stick some hooks and eyes on it, and that'll be it. And that is the last machine stitching on this dress.
I'm sewing the overskirt ruching in place by hand with tiny spaced back stitches, much less visible than machine stitching. Both under and overskirt close with several hooks and eyes of the placket, which also have to be sewn on by hand. And finally, here it is. The underskirt alone is fun, but the overskirt really makes it look stylish and sophisticated. For Carolina, this skirt and overskirt would have represented so much. The days she worked to afford the fabric, the hours of time she spent sewing, and the pride she could feel sitting down to Shabbat dinner, going to services, walking in the park on a Saturday. The streets of America were not paved with gold, and my ancestor could never afford to dress like a fashion plate. Life was hard, but that only made the small victories more meaningful. Next episode, we'll come back to the top of the dress. Subscribe if you haven't yet to see that when it comes out. Until then, tell me in the comments what small luxuries your ancestors might have found meaningful, and I'll see you next time.